The biggest accomplishment a UFC fighter can do is become an undisputed world champion. Now, unfortunately, there are many great fighters that for whatever reason have just never touched gold. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. The best fighters who never became champion. Now, before I get into it, this list is in no particular order. And another thing is, if they win an interim champ, I don't count that as winning gold. This is only for undisputed UFC World Championship. Especially in this list, the fighters I'm about to name, some of them have been interim champs, but they've never been undisputed champs. So that's why I'd still put them on the list. Now, starting out with number 1 is Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier might as well be the best fighter who has never won undisputed gold. I mean, he's beaten some of the best, all-time bests. But for whatever reason, as soon as he gets paired up to fight for the belt, he always loses. He always gets choked out, matter of fact. Rear naked choke. And not even that, you can't even blame the guy, because the guys he goes up against are just straight demons. As we take a look at his record right here, he's beaten guys like Eddie Alvarez, a former champ, Anthony Pettis, former champ, Justin Gaethje, arguably a top 5 lightweight of all time, Max Holloway, a former champ now, but at the time was the current featherweight champ. Even Michael Chandler, who is a decorated Bellator champ. He's also beaten Conor McGregor twice, avenged his loss. He gets on these crazy win streaks, then runs into people like Khabib or people like Oliveira. And then the rest is history. You know, his kryptonite rear naked choke. Now, moving on to the next person that I want to mention is Alexander Gustafsson. Gustafsson, man, he had it all. He was a complete fighter and a big fighter for that weight class. I mean, his boxing was just mad crispy, especially for that light heavyweight division. I mean, he's beaten guys like Matt Hamill, who beat John Jones. And then he fought John Jones and arguably won, but gave him his toughest challenge up to that point. Because at that time, John Jones was just mopping the floor with everybody in that division. Until he ran into Gustafsson, where he really had to dig deep. He also beat guys like Blachowicz, who was a future champ at that time. And a guy like Teixeira, who was another future champ. But, like I mentioned, his era was just filled with absolute killers. Like John Jones, I mentioned, arguably the greatest UFC fighter, MMA fighter of all time, period. Anthony Johnson, Daniel Cormier. Like, you can't really blame the guy, because he went up and lost against some absolute legends of the sport. You know, he had a legendary career, and then he ended up losing to Anthony Smith. That just shouldn't happen. How do you go from almost beating John Jones to losing to Anthony Smith and getting finished by him at that? He ended up retiring after Anthony Smith, and then he decided to come back, make a heavyweight debut, lost, got finished. Then he tried to come back again to light heavyweight this time, his original weight class, and then got finished again. It's honestly a sad way to see a career end. Now, this next person I'm about to mention is a bit controversial, but y'all gotta hear me out. And that is Colby Covington. Now, this is gonna be a bold statement, especially because I'm making this video on Thursday, which is about 48 hours before he's about to fight for the belt. So, this could age extremely poorly, but I don't think it will. Now, as we take a look at his record, his best win, Dos Anjos, he beat and won the interim belt, but was not for undisputed. And Dos Anjos was a former champ. Robbie Lawler, a former champ. And Tyron Woodley, a former champ. He's beaten 3 former champs. Yeah, you could say they were over the hump. Well, you could definitely say that, because Woodley at that time was not the same Woodley. He somehow forgot how to fight. Same thing, just Robbie Lawler just didn't have it in him no more. But these guys were all past their prime. Oh, you got to just give it to him. He's being former champs. It is what it is. And then he gave Usman 2 tough fights. I know the second one wasn't as competitive, but he recovered very well after getting dropped twice in 1 round. That was wild. He gave him a competitive fight, which at the time he was pound for pound one of the greatest fighters on the planet at that time. Now, the reason I put him on this list is he is a really good fighter. Say what you want. I know his resume is shallow. He definitely has the tools to become champion, but I don't think he will. As you can see here, he every time he goes for a run at the title, he gets stopped by Usman. And now the same thing with Leon Edwards. I don't think he makes it past him. I think Edwards actually finishes him. Because 2 years out is kind of crazy. And Edwards has been on a tear. And I do not see him becoming champ. Especially with this new generation of talent that is on the rise in the welterweight division. Like Shavkat. And even Hamzat, if he gets his shit together and goes on a diet. Now I know that was a bit controversial. But this next one is even more controversial. The next person that I have on my list is Chael Sonnen. Now, if you take a look at his record, for some reason there's quite a few L's, but everybody knows that's all politics. That's all for show. Because Chael Sonnen is undefeated. Now, as we take a look at his record here, like I mentioned, he's undefeated. So don't let these losses bother you. But let's take a little deeper dive into it. He was so damn close to getting his hand on a belt against Anderson Silva. And then, let's just move on from that. He then went on to fight Anderson Silva again and somehow lost that fight even though he didn't. He fought John Jones for the light heavyweight champion right after fighting for the middleweight champion. And they didn't give him the belt. I think the UFC just be doing my boy Sonnen dirty. They got all these losses on his record. I'm sure he never lost. He should have been a 10-time champion. But in all honesty, jokes aside, Chael Sonnen also, I wish he became champ. He was a former WEC champ. He even tried his hand at Bellator and came up short. And he was a really good fighter as well. Now going on to the next person is none other than Anthony Johnson. Now rest in peace, Anthony Johnson. Him passing away was honestly heartbreaking, especially at that young of an age. So rest in peace to him. But he was one of the most feared fighters in UFC history, especially at that time. He was pretty much the Ngannou of the light heavyweight division, because he had that right hand that would just nuke anybody. Just anybody in his way just would violate. But he just never got his hands on gold. And it was kind of like the Gustafsson situation, where his era was just filled with Hall of Famers and legends. Now, as we take a look at his record here, he fought Daniel Cormier for the vacant light heavyweight belt and then lost against him, got finished by rear naked choke. And then that's no shame in that, because it's DC. The guy is the Hall of Fame, arguably the second greatest light heavyweight champion of all time. He then went on to fight DC again and came up short again. Ended up retiring and then moved on to Bellator. Look, his record is pretty deep. He's beating guys like Gustafsson, who at the time was phenomenal. He's also beating guys like Ryan Bader, who became a staple in Bellator, an absolute world beater in Bellator. And he also beat Glover Teixeira, who became a future UFC light heavyweight champ. If DC had moved to heavyweight during this time, I definitely would think he would have became champion. And even his move to Bellator, he was doing good. You've seen that he won by KO in normal Rumble fashion. Winning by KO is nothing new here. But he was on his way to getting that shot, and I think he would have done well and became a Bellator champ at least. You could also see that he started his fight career at a lower weight class. He was a light heavyweight, but he also fought as low as welterweight. I'll imagine that he's starting dudes at light heavyweight. If somehow he was able to keep making welterweight, even middleweight, I think we would have had a way better and easier shot at becoming champ. And that would have been great to see. Now, the next and last person I want to talk about, everybody loves this guy. He's a fan favorite. No matter how many times he loses, we're still going to tune in and we're still going to support this guy. He's fighting this weekend. That is Tony Ferguson. I mean, you can't talk about fighters who never became undisputed champ without mentioning Tony Ferguson. This guy was the boogeyman in the most stacked division, in the most stacked era of that division. As we take a look at his record, he's beating guys like Edson Barboza, who was in his prime at that time, Dos Anjos, who was at his prime at that time, Kevin Lee, who is one of the GOATs of the sport, Anthony Pettis, a former champion, and even Cerrone. He had one of the most legendary 12-fight streaks in history, and he also had one of the most exciting styles you could find in a fighter. And it's unfortunate that he's never even gotten a chance to fight for undisputed. He fought for interim twice, but never undisputed. And the case for that is just pure bad luck. The timing was off. The Khabib fights kept getting canceled. And then with McGregor holding up the division for damn near a year and a half almost, it just was unlucky. The fight with him and Kevin Lee should have been for the undisputed belt. And I would say the UFC robbed him of that chance. And then he fought Justin Gaethje for the interim belt, and then the rest was history. We don't really need to get into all that. But I'm hoping that he gets through Paddy Pimblett this weekend. And Tony for Champ 2024, let's get it. But that was it, guys. These are the fighters who I believe are the best fighters who unfortunately just never got to touch gold, never became undisputed champ. And let me know who you guys got in your list as the best fighters who never won undisputed gold.
Damn, son, where'd you find this?